Well, good morning and welcome to Hudson Institute. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson Institute. Welcome to the Betsy and Walter Stern Center at Hudson Institute. And today is actually the 90th birthday of Wally Stern, our beloved Chairman Emeritus, who has been so critical to this organization and couldn't be up here without wishing Wally a very happy birthday from all of us here at Hudson who adore him. I'd like to welcome you today to our panel discussion, our seminar on U.S. China trade relations and challenges, past, present, and future. And this is sort of a unique event for us here at Hudson Institute. I am delighted to welcome the president of the Center for China and Globalization, Huiyao Henry Wang, here to Hudson Institute for what we hope will be a frank discussion on the growing trade tensions between our two countries and what needs to be done to help move the relationship forward to address trade imbalances. As China's opening to the world, as we know, which began in earnest economically with the Deng Xiaoping era and was followed by China's accession to the World Trade Organization, brought prosperity to hundreds of millions of people in China, turned China into a manufacturing hub, and created this growing middle class in China, which has been incredible for global prosperity and for global development. But as numerous U.S. presidents, and most notably the Trump administration has noted in particular, we have yet to see China fully liberalize or open its markets to American investors. And what we here at Hudson Institute have decided to do, given the tensions on trade between the U.S. and China, and these efforts were undertaken by our Director of Chinese Strategy, Dr. Michael Pillsbury, the noted veteran China watcher, the eminence grise in the Trump administration, and the author of a very important book, The 100-Year Marathon, a New York Times bestseller, widely read by key officials in the Trump administration, key members of Congress, and also widely read in China in both its legal and pirated translations, I should note. The book is a critically important book because it explores the strategic impact of China's focus on its economic prowess, what it means for China, and what China's economic plans have been. And I should note that Mike's book really was the first to come out to make this warning very clearly at a time when people still had a much more positive view of China's economic development and what could globally call the intent of Chinese leaders through its economic development. And Mike proposed this session, proposed holding this event, and we agreed to do it, and we, meaning Hudson Institute, agreed to do it, knowing that there are serious issues in the U.S.-China relationship, serious issues that need to be discussed, and issues that range from patterns of intellectual property theft, the role of heavily subsidized state-owned industries, tied in some cases to the People's Liberation Army, but also to other ministries, trade undertaken for strategic purposes at below market cost, and there's dumping of products. There's a long list of issues that we're here to discuss on the American side, and we do it here at a venue, Hudson Institute, where our Chinese guests, and we're delighted to welcome you here, know that there is no better place in Washington to have this discussion, because we at Hudson Institute have been persistent critics of China's military. We view ourselves, first I should note, as friends of China and the Chinese people, and dedicated to the serious study of China, serious analysis of China. But that being said, we have been persistent critics of China's military buildup, of IP theft, of China's attempt to dominate 5G. We have been critics of what China has done through its state-owned enterprises. We have been defenders of human rights. We have focused on the Taiwanese model of democracy. I'm chairman of Radio Free Asia, and my work there in a personal capacity is well known. And we are also looking forward to welcoming Senator Marco Rubio here on October 24th to keynote a conference we're doing with Freedom House on Chinese influence operations in the United States. So I say all this not to be a rude host, but to just be absolutely transparent to those we are hosting and to our audience, to say that we at Hudson Institute, we are tough on China. We are not like the other think tanks that our guests normally deal with here in Washington, but we are committed to having an open-minded discussion with a leading Chinese think tank with whom we have disagreements on policy, in the hope that together we can point the way towards a better trade relationship and a better relationship free of the illusions of the past. And that's our hope for the discussion today. And I want to welcome you for coming into the Lion's Den here at Hudson. And I should note on a personal note that yesterday the White House announced President Trump's intent to nominate me to the Advisory Committee for Trade Policy Negotiations. This is just an intent to nominate, but I mention this simply to say that I'm speaking here in my own capacity. I am not yet a member of the Advisory Committee for Trade Policy Negotiations. When the nomination is formal and hopefully approved, I look forward to working closely with Ambassador Lighthizer and his team on its important work. So let me say that by way of general introduction. And at this point, I will happily turn the microphone over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Michael Pillsbury, so he can introduce Dr. Wang, the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. I really want to give you a warm Hudson Institute welcome. Thank you.
I shake your hand. That's if we get started. Thank you, President Weinstein. We have a kind of informal approach today. We're going to have two panels. First, Dr. Wang Henry and Mabel are going to give us, I hope the slides will work. They're going to give us a briefing on their report. Then the two panels each will have some period of question and answer from the audience. The main point today is CCG, the short name for Dr. Wang's think tank in China, which I visited. It's highly influential. They have three co-chairmen as on their advisory council, I guess you would call it. One is a former Vice Foreign Minister Huiyao. One is the senior official who negotiated China's entry in WTO, Long Chongtu. So his think tank is extremely influential in China. And he has prepared and released to us yesterday a report which is extremely constructive. He takes a look at the frictions, the disputes, and he makes China's case in great detail. He cites the number of American companies who oppose the tariffs. He cites the number of American witnesses who oppose the tariffs. It's very detailed, many footnotes to American media sources I had not seen. But that's not all. The second half of the report, he has more than 10 really specific negotiating offers. So how do we discuss this report today? Not everybody has it. I'm going to bring up my agreement and mainly disagreement. I believe there's not enough. It's an offer that if the Chinese government makes it, it could make President Trump very angry because it does not go very far in meeting all of his concerns. So it could be a disaster if President Xi Jinping takes the advice of Dr. Wang and CCG. But what is the good news? His think tank, his team that wrote this, about 7 people, they had the guts in China to take on the issue and then make a case for some reforms and some changes. I think we have to applaud. I applaud Dr. Wang for that. Congratulations. So we welcome you, but we also oppose some of the suggestions you're making. And I'm hoping on the panels we get into more details about these issues. Finally, he has 3 scenarios in the report that you and I discussed in Beijing. One, I think we wanted to call the happy scenario, where in the near term, the trade disagreements are resolved satisfactorily. It's win-win, as China likes to say, and there's no escalation in tariffs, and there's no new Cold War. The second scenario in detail is about a fairly long Cold War. China does not take seriously Mr. Trump's demands, and there's 25% placed tariff on all Chinese imports to America. Third possibility is the worst case of all. In China, it's called New Cold War. So the trade conflict continues, escalates, and it spills over into other areas, so that the United States begins to adopt a policy toward China, as President Reagan did with the famous NSDD 32 and NSDD 75, a little bit like what Truman did with NSC 68. And we're just in the first phase. We're in the first 2 or 3 years of a really serious U.S. China Cold War. A couple days ago, a famous Fox host, Henry Wang knows this, proposed to a 1 million person audience on Fox a complete economic boycott of China. Nobody laughed. This is taken as, it's a somewhat extreme, but it's the kind of thing being discussed now. So we want to be friendly, as Ken Weinstein said, but we also want the message to go back to Beijing. A lot of Americans are still very angry about Chinese trade practices and deception. So I'm criticized in China, in the media, as a secret CIA agent who runs around trying to influence China. Henry receives the same treatment from some of our reporters, that somehow he's with a covert influence operation in China. But actually, it's a good thing. It gets both of us more respect, and we are listened to more. So Henry, I think you and Mabel want to do the briefing. I hope the slides work. So I really want to thank you for being courageous to come into the lion's den.
Just
see if the laptop works.
Yeah. Okay, Mr. President Ken Wenshan and Mr. Pillsbury, distinguished guests we're going to have this morning, and also we had the honor of Mr. Minister Consular Tian from Chinese Embassy as well, and his colleagues, and all the friends here. So it's really a great honor to be here at Hudson, and I appreciate the hosting of Hudson for CCG. So we are here to bridge the gap, to also to present our think tank's point of view, and it's also attract two exchanges. And we've been visiting a number of think tanks. I think the event that we're having here to present CCG's latest report on China-U.S. trade relations is really relevant. So once again, we appreciate the hosting of Hudson for us to deliver this report, and also we have two excellent panels we're going to follow on that to discuss all those issues at the timing that is really so crucial and so important. So once again, I appreciate this opportunity. So I would like to have Dr. Miao, who is our Vice President of CCG, to present first part of that, and I will continue for the rest of it. Thank you.
Please come up, take seats.
Mr. President Weinstein, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to be here to introduce CCG's report, China-U.S. Trade Relations and Challenge, Past, Present, Future, and Policy Options. Yes, our report is divided into 4 parts. The first part is going to review 40 years of China-U.S. trade and economic relations. Second part is related to the development of U.S.-China trade conflict. It's about the current situation. Then CCG forecast the future of U.S.-China trade conflict. Finally, CCG put forward 10 recommendations to our current situation to the 2 countries' policymakers to deal with the current situation. This year marks 40 years of China's reform and opening up, and 40 years since the establishment of two countries' diplomatic ties. And in the past 4 decades, U.S. played a positive role in China's reform and opening up. In the third plenum of the 13th CCP, Central Committee at the end of 1978 made the decision that China would reform and opening up to the world. President Jimmy Carter decided to establish diplomatic ties with China on January 1st, 1979, and Deng Xiaoping visited the U.S. on January 29. In the same year, the U.S. granted China Most Favored Nation status. In 1981, the Reagan administration created separate trade category for China to accept it from trade restriction applied for other communist countries. The Clinton administration granted China permanent normal trade relations ahead of China's WTO entry in 2001. The bilateral commercial relationship is mutually beneficial. Since China joined WTO, U.S. exports to China have increased by 500%, far exceeding the 19% increase in U.S. global exports over the same period. By 2017, China has become the second largest destination for U.S. exports, and the U.S. enjoyed a trade surplus in services of $53 billion over China. In 2017, the United States exported more goods to China than ever before, more than $127 billion. U.S. exports of goods to China have grown by 86% over the last decade, while exports to the rest of the world grew by only 21%. Cumulative FDI from the U.S. reached $82.5 billion with 68,000 companies set up in China. U.S. companies generate $500 billion in sales annually in China. Inflation in the U.S., which averaged 5.4% from 1963 to 1989, fell to just 2.5% from 1989 to 2015, in large part due to growing imports of consumer goods from China. In commercial Chinese production, saved the average U.S. household $850 each year. U.S. China two-way investment contributed $216 billion to U.S. GDP, supporting 2.6 million American workers. Chinese firms have cumulatively invested over $140 billion across 46 U.S. states, creating over 140,000 jobs. There are some examples of Chinese companies investing in U.S. Like Wenshan Group invested in nearly 30 factories across U.S., creating 12,500 jobs. Huiyao Glass announced last year that it was ready to increase its investment in its U.S. production facilities to $1 billion with thousands of more jobs opportunities offered to local residents. There are still some comparative advantage for U.S. and China. The U.S. has a comparative advantage in capital-intensive industries, while China's comparative advantage lies in labor-intensive sectors. Primary industry account for 8% of China's GDP and just 1% of the U.S. economy, while secondary industries make up 20% of China's economy and 12% in the U.S. In China, tertiary sector makes up just over half of GDP, while this figure is 79% in the U.S. From this structure, we can see that China's economy is based on agriculture and manufacturing, in contrast to the U.S., while services are the driving force of the economy. China and U.S. economic cooperation under the global value chain. 2011 OECD project shows that for all Chinese exports in electronics and optical equipment manufacturing, domestic value-added share of gross exports is only 46%. In 2016, 77% of high-tech exports were manufactured by foreign invested enterprises. The case of Apple illustrates that, and simply in China, accounts for only 3 to 6% of the 370 manufacturing cost of an iPhone X, with the bulk of the value ended going to American tech giant. Morgan Stanley estimates that the U.S. firm's revenue exposure to China reached around $400 billion in 2017, about 3 times more than its exports to China. There are a few extensive people-to-people ties between China and U.S. For example, in the field of education, 350,000 Chinese students studying in the U.S. spent about $55,000 per person in 2016, contributing around $16 billion of revenue to the U.S. And in the field of tourism, the U.S. is the number 4 popular destination for Chinese outbound tourists in 2016. In the year alone, 3 million Chinese tourists spent a total of $33 billion on their U.S. trips. So the rest of the report will be delivered by my president, Wang Huiyao. So please.
Great. Yeah, I'm going to the policy on that. That's right. Great. Thanks again for having this opportunity. So I think that the report that actually CCG made is actually also out of a discussion we had in Beijing last May. Actually, we hope that we can have some a Chinese perspective of looking at those, but also discussing with our American colleagues on how we can solve those issues. So those are the purpose of this discussion. Actually, we can see that actually the development of U.S.-China trade deficit, of course, is the hot issue on everybody's mind in the last several months, but almost 5-6 months now. So the round of tariff exchanged, I think, has been escalating, and so there's a 25% tariff already is having, and also 50 billion, 200 billion, what have you. So that actually is escalating. So it's caused a lot of concerns, I think, in both countries and to the rest of the world. So this is really a key timing, I think, at this moment, that we exchange about those ideas, we talk about those things, particularly through the dialogue, through the think tank channels, so that we avoid really the misunderstanding, but also enhanced understanding of both parties. So you can see that actually there's a lot of concerns, as a matter of fact. Chinese concern for the damage as well. We would see the U.S.-China trade conflict is actually a lose-lose to both countries. Dr. Pillsbury mentioned about China wants to have a win-win, but actually if we continue, this will be a lose-lose situation for both countries.
Sometimes win-win means China wins twice.
but if it's lose, that I think both countries lose. I really hope that both China and U.S. wins. So that'd be really great. But this is also, I think, this uncertainty will have headwinds on China's economic growth, and a potential spillover to economic areas beyond trade. I mean, this is so probably obvious. A negative impact on the world economy and global supply chain that we've been building in the last 7 decades, actually, particularly in the last 4 decades. So I think there's a lot of concerns for the damage in China as well. But more precisely, because we've been also studying the response of U.S. companies and industry groups, that we found that there's more concerns in the U.S. On these trade frictions. For example, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce predicted the trade war will put over 250,000 jobs at risk. The Tax Foundation said that the trade war will have already lowered the U.S. workers' wage by 0.6%, while reducing 365,000 job opportunities. So it's quite a consensus. The National Association of Chemical Distributors said nearly 28,000 chemical distributors and suppliers' jobs would be eliminated because of high prices from this $200 billion tariff. And Axios also reported that retaliation of Chinese tariff would affect 11 million American workers concentrated in the rural, deep red, already striking part of U.S., which is precisely the Rust Belt state that President Trump wants to revigorate. And Peters Institute, of course, also mentioned that even the short-term trade war could lead to a private sector employment force of 1.3 million. And Moody's analysis is 150,000 jobs would be lost in the U.S. if the current trade tariff continues. So you can see there is quite a widespread of a consensus that across all the industry board and companies. But also, if you talk about sectors, we can say that agriculture sector, as we all know, the U.S. is one of the main export of soybeans, and that can be at risk. Auto industry, of course, China now produces more cars in the United States. U.S. auto industry has actually produced more cars in China than in the United States. And even Tesla announced they're going to have 100% owned subsidiary in China. But GM, Boeing, so you can see the industry across industry has a lot of impact. And not to mention also in the high-tech sectors as well, that the company that will have suffered. So that's really, a very, very gloomy situation. And you can see that even Apple actually think about that. They had mentioned the tariff on Chinese goods would increase the cost of U.S. corporation, divert our resources and disadvantage Apple compared to foreign competitors. So the industry giant has actually, like Intel, like Dell, HP, and all the high-tech companies have a lot of concerns. That is actually coming out of U.S. industry leaders. So we can see that is a very obvious situation that we're going to have. I would like to cite the latest, actually, just out of this month, fresh figures. The impact on U.S. tariff on your business, that the survey has been done by AmCham China through a large database of its companies, also AmCham Shanghai as well. So if they will ask the impact of U.S. tariffs on your business, almost half of that said, the U.S. would have added by tariff, U.S. would affect them. Of course, they add on top of the Chinese tariffs on that. So you can see it's quite a negative impact to the U.S. operations in China. Almost half of that agreed on that, and that's quite a large number of concerns that we should look into. And furthermore, actually, the industry most impacted by this 50 billion and 60 billion and 200 billion, whatever they have on a tariff, machinery will be affected, electronic industry will be affected, automobile industry will be affected, agriculture, chemical, healthcare, and all the other industries, and aerospace, electronics. So basically all of them, 80% of them will be impacted. So that's quite a serious situation according to our understanding. And also that we can see the impact on business operations, again, according to the AmCham China and AmCham Shanghai, that increase the cost of manufacturing. Almost half of them says that we certainly do. Decrease the demand for the product. Of course, China is the biggest, one of the biggest market, and that will be also impact on that. So it's quite a wide ranging of assessment from both U.S. business community in the U.S. and also in the business community in China, have quite a big consensus on that. So we have to probably look at that as well. And of course, on the domestic feedback on the tariffs, even on the domestic, you have Congress, people actually, the Senate of the, by July 11, there was overwhelming majority of 88 to 11 votes passed on non-binding motion to give Congress a role in decision-making process at tariffs. So I think there's some also feedback from Congress. You can see the non-supportive of the tariff measures. And House actually, 140 House members wrote a letter to the President, to the U.S. Commerce Secretary, advising also against imposing tariffs. So a tariff is really a bad measurement to do that. And of course, trade associations, 60 of them, U.S. trade groups, launched a coalition called American for Free Trade, composed of thousands of companies actually also saying that. There's a sub-national government actually on that. There's companies, there's also in the state and the municipalities have all actually given this kind of complaints and calling for non-tariff measures to solve the problem. Now, I would like to go to the future of U.S.-China trade conflict. We've been seeing that probably there's, according to a framework of analysis, there's always three scenarios: the good scenario, the median scenario, the bad scenario. So we'll always take this analytical approach on that. So you can see the scenario of the possible outcome. If we have the best scenario, so then we should have the agreement reached, the de-escalation, and then so that's the ideal one, of course. At least CCG is hoping for. So I think, yeah, this is the win-win for both U.S. and China. And then we have a median scenario, and whereas periodical escalation and de-escalation into the future, so that we can see it is affected, but it's not devastating as we can see in the worst case scenario, that where the escalation into a full-blown trade war, which is nobody wants that actually, or wants to see that happen. So the first scenario, maybe I'll give a little bit of explanation on that. So which means that two sides will reach agreement and subsequently hold tariff measures. I think that we can see that the U.S.-China history that had witnessed the dispute all along, but in the history of the last 4 decades, we have been always able to resolve them through negotiations and talks. So I can still see that both sides still express willingness to talk, which I think is still in the right direction. So given the concerns on the farmers losing their job, given the, there's a lot of political feedback in U.S., I think, there's quite a bit of a concern there as well, so that how can we solve that could be an issue that we can see. But also there's an upcoming meeting on the G20 summit in November. So we hope that when both presidents meet, that we can pave the way for the further reaching agreement through the discussion of both countries. So political motive, also some people say political motive of the president in launching the tariff is maybe towards the, will be subsidized after the midterm elections, and which, we will have, President Trump will have to focus more on the domestic issues, and that those China-U.S. trade stuff will probably subside to some extent. So this, for example, President Trump will be more on the infrastructure and how to make America great again, then maybe focus more on the domestic agenda rather than those international ones. So we can see the outcome of this, and also the trade deficit. The thing that we have a bit of optimism is that we already reached agreement in one of our talks. I think last time when Vice Premier Liu He came to Washington, they already reached agreement. U.S. was asking for 100 billion deficit reduction. China agreed to 70 billion of that. So it's quite a bit close. And plus China has agreed to purchase 250 billion during President Trump's visit to China. So you can say that there's really not a huge difference in terms of cutting the trade deficit there. And then, of course, on the progress on the market access, China has been doing a lot of trade tariff reduction lately. For example, China cut the auto import tariff by half just recently by itself. And also China has, on the 11 items, China has actually announced in April, China has actually is going all on those 11 items of deficit trade and tariff reductions. And also that's cutting a lot of restricting regulatory in 22 sectors, and also opened 100% ownership of a Tesla plant in China. And also some concerns like Made China 2025 actually still was a visionary plan by the Ministry of Industry and Information. So I think there's a lot of chance, as the Premier Li said, welcome the foreign participation. And also one of the things I think concerned U.S. colleagues quite a lot is the forced technology transfer. I think that Chinese government leaders have said again and again that they are not really agree on forced technology transfer, and if anybody has that case, please tell the authorities that they want to work on that. And so one of the 301 actually report on the forced technology transfer by the White House report, it was said that only 90% complained, and 2/3 of that companies complained and identified Chinese business partners. So it's not an overall majority of that. It's only 90%, and then out of 19%, 2/3 said it was not the government; it was actually the business. So you can see that Chinese government has actually have a zero tolerance for technology, forced technology transfer, and has always said again that it's not allowed. So I think philosophically, there's no difference in terms of IPR issues and the forced technology transfer between the U.S. leadership and Chinese leadership. I think they're talking the same philosophy and principles. So I think that there's also 28 billion paid for foreign property rights, a 50-time jump since China joined WTO. So China is actually doing a lot of things that IPR duty system as well. So China set up a 3 intellectual property protection court in China, and just handling this kind of complaints by foreign companies. Actually, the foreign company complaints of the IP violation cases in China, the win cases for foreigners are about 80%. So it's a vast majority of them, if they complain to Chinese intellectual property court, they will win largely in those situations. So you can see that we've been thinking there's a lot of common ground in this first scenario, and Chinese customer bought 120 million cars imported from the U.S. Now with the trade sanctions, now Germany become the largest exporter of cars to China now. So that it's really hard to see that U.S. has built up this manufacturing base and has also established the channels to export our vehicles to China to be affected by this trade war. So also there's a research actually done by Tsinghua University estimate that increase of 3 million auto imports would result in US $100 billion reduction to the deficit and revive the auto industry. So you see there's a lot of good things that if two countries can work together, and also China is reducing the tariff on importing US cars, and of course US and $20 billion deals offered by President Trump, and that has actually a lot of natural gas, energy, and so there's a lot of areas that we can work together, and particularly in those areas of strong sectors and energy resources and all the benefit that if we reach agreement that we can have. The second scenario, of course, that we can see is the companies like to linger into the future, turning into a new normal probably in the bilateral relations, and in the next few years we'll probably see a periodical escalation alternate with times of consolidation and rounds of threats and talks. So that's something it's probably happening, but it's definitely not as good as the first scenario, which is no good. And we can see that this we have the China and the U.S. both work on those issues, zigzag, and so this is actually the things that probably happening already now. But we hope that we'll get back to the first scenario. But nonetheless, I think China's own drive to deep its reform and opening up is another de-escalating factor, because China wants to do reform regardless others' opinion, because China, for its own sake, it's the 40th anniversary of this year, and they want to do it for China's own sake. So that would be really to have the domestic reform and opening up continues, and that also a positive contributing factors. I think that the third scenario which we analyze, which is the worst scenario, of course, and which nobody wants to see, I suppose, and is escalating in the all-out trade war, and it will only produce negative impact on two countries. So and also disrupted the global value chain, and also slowing down, even stop the growth of the much needed global growth. And so this is really, there's a lot of data on that already. So if the trade war continues, it could cause considerable shocks to both Chinese and U.S. economy. And Morgan Stanley has estimated that there will be 0.3, 0.4 percentage point losses for U.S. economy growth. And Moody, inflation would be hosted by a tenth of a percentage point by this time next year if those tariffs materialize. So impact on U.S. capital market, the bull market probably will have a stop. If the trade war continues, and U.S. company listed companies will also suffer, and U.S. household will likely to pay more for buying Chinese household, and there's a collateral damage to our both global value chain and disrupt Asian economy within the supply chain. Hurt companies of course both not only U.S. and China but the rest of the world, and also for global economy is really a dangerous scenario that we cannot afford to see that. So finally, I would like to touch on the recommendations by our think tank actually. So we have outlined quite a few, and so the first recommendation is that to build on agreement that already reached between China and the U.S. already through, we had quite a few rounds of negotiations, so we should build on that and to continue to discuss through dialogue and sensible discussions, so that we can find new ways of tap into the potential of both countries of the market. Of course, particularly the market in China is the biggest market, and also the e-trade. China and the U.S. are our largest e-trading nations, and that is a new area of growth as well for both China and U.S. So this is the area that I think we can work on. The second recommendation is that we should probably forge a new bilateral agreement on intellectual property right as well, as Chinese government has also emphasized that maybe through WTO, through all those channels, there's always a way to look on this. China actually is already does that by itself, setting up intellectual property courts and strengthening the inspection of the market bureau. So those are the new area that I think that we can already have, so that we can build on that as well. The third recommendation is that we should increase the opportunity for U.S. company in China made 2025. I think there's some quite big concerns on that, but actually Chinese government also mentioned again that it's welcome U.S. companies, European companies to participate in the 2025. It's not a cast in the stone. This is still evolving, and it's not like a 35 years plan that is budget allocated, things are already undertaken. So it's still visionary. I think there's quite a bit of chance, as Premier Li has said, welcome foreigners to participate and to get involved. And so the fourth recommendation is that we should seek further tariff reductions through bilateral negotiations and re-engage BIT talks. China and the U.S. has already done the BIT talks for many times, actually almost conclude that during the last administration. So we should work on that continuously and trying to work on that to get the result. Even maybe getting the free trade talks in the future, as U.S. is now talking with EU and Japan, and so we should probably do that. And the U.S. should also probably rely on this reform and relax on this CVIS review, which I think it's preventing Chinese investment into U.S. and which is no good for if we cannot increase the investment exchanges between our two countries. So number 5 is that recommendation we could suggest is build on the foundation of the domestic reform that China's already had to rebalance the Chinese and U.S. economy. So there's a way to achieve the trade balance. I think there's a structural problem in both countries. We need to address that. The U.S. saving is quite low. China needs to stimulate its domestic consumptions. So we have a lot of things to do on both countries to put our more effectiveness into our economy, so that we can have a better reform, that we can better fit each other on those trade issues. The sixth recommendation is that update the way the China-US trade is measured and accurately reflect the value divided by each side. I think this is also quite a big concern on the business community and for the think tanks, because the calculation we are using now is really based on 20th century. Now the service trade with China, which US has a huge surplus with China, was not calculated. For example, there's a 3 million tourists from China tour United States, spend 30 billion and things like that. It was not calculated. Also, the patent fee paid by Chinese company to the US is not counted. So there's a variety of trade sectors, which is US has a huge surplus, is not calculated into that. So we should probably reform that to have a better reflection of the trade figures. The last two or three recommendations is that the 7th is to expand the cooperation in infrastructure and exploring the creating Sino-US Infrastructure Investment Fund. President Trump announced that the U.S. is going to revigorate its infrastructure, announced about $1 trillion plan for the infrastructure project, but we haven't seen really much growth on that. So China has actually benefited its 40 years growth on the infrastructure in the last 4 decades. There's a lot of things that we can share and we can contribute to each other in terms of make those infrastructure works better for both countries. So I think that those areas that could be further continues. And also, as I said in the last recommendation, that also tourism, China can increase, right now it's about 3 million, we can have 5 million, we can have more tourists coming to the United States to have a good enough business for airlines, restaurants, hotels. So there's a big potential. China has a 100 million tourists touring around the world. It's only 3 million coming to the United States. So there's a lot of things that we can do better on that. And also that China and US can work together to reform WTO. I mean, that's China already said its white paper published 2 days ago, and I think China and the European has already worked into that direction. And I think WTO is a trade platform for the last 4 decades, for the last 7 decades actually, and it's benefited everybody. Of course, it should be reformed, and I think that's for China and the U.S., the 2 largest economies in the world, should work together to work on to make this platform even more efficient. And of course, our last recommendation is also to strengthen the Sino-U.S. cooperation between provinces and states. We understand we have a lot of governors visiting China. The mayor of Chicago was visiting China, signing a 5-year cooperation. There's a lot of potential between the state and the provinces between the 2 countries. So we should really, on those levels, particularly those hard hit in the Midwest and states, which China has a lot of investment there, we should continue the cooperation. And finally, we should really also develop the track 2 dialogue. I think that the one that we're having right now here at Hudson is one of the examples that we should have more of this, and it needs the wisdom and ideas from think tanks of both countries to really find a solution and recommendation to both governments. And so we should probably also focus, not on the tariff, tit for tat, this kind of narrative. We should think about, how we can benefit and how we can keep the world in prosperity and have another, 4 decades of continuous growth between U.S. and China and the rest of the world. So I think I'm going to conclude that. And the final thought is that the 2 economies are really, U.S. and China, which intertwined in a globalized world. And they have in fact constituted a single community of shared interests. So U.S. and China are really a big community of shared interests. And that is inseparable. And it's like a husband and wife. You can quarrel, but it's hard to get divorced. So I think that is really a way of China-U.S. relation. Although China middle class will reach 600 million in the next 5-10 years. So it's twice of the population of the U.S. It's going to be the largest market probably in the world. So are U.S. ready, after 4 decades of hardworking China, to abandon this market for the U.S. business? That's really a hard question, I think, for everyone to think about. And also China now is going to have more consumption power and buying more U.S. products. And really, it's really good for those countries. And finally, I think the trade issues should now fall into the strategic misjudgment for both countries, because we should really think about, we have the 70 years of peace and prosperity in the last 7 decades. So we should not fighting between the number 1 and the 2 economy of the world. We should really work together to make the world more peaceful and prosperous in the next 7 decades. Thank you very much.
You want to have American go next or more Chinese speakers?
Whatever. I think we have a panel discussion.
Okay. Thank you. I hope you were not disappointed. Henry has some very specific recommendations for the two governments to consider. You left 2 or 3 of your best ideas out, actually, that China should form a kind of CFIUS type committee to help protect American companies and make sure American companies in China are treated well. I thought that was a good idea. You left out another idea of forming, it's in your report, of forming a sort of new agency in China that looks into intellectual property theft and protection of
They already have that.
rights.
Yeah, we could work on that. Yeah.
So I would try to count, Henry, how many proposals you have in here. I think it's really at least 12. So if we were both back in the government, if you were back in the Commerce Department in China and I were back somewhere, we would try to focus on the negotiating points, right? That would be the approach. I hope the panel is going to think this way. American side, back in early May, put forward 24 points, and they were divided into 8 sections. And somebody leaked it to Bloomberg News, so this is still online. The Chinese side also leaked it to WeChat. Americans complained, we know this was a private paper given to you, and Chinese side said, well, this is accident, and took it down from WeChat. But everybody in China knows the 24 points the Americans demanded, and they attacked it. They said, this is humiliation, this is an opium war, Boxer expedition, we cannot possibly agree to any of these 24 points. So the news today is a CCG report written by 8 or 9 people. You are examining constructively some of the 24 points. So I have to thank you for that. And today you didn't mention opium war or Boxer expedition. Another big word sometimes used by Chinese embassy here is defamation. These allegations are defamation of China. When you proposed new agencies or you focused on the new courts, you are constructively replying to the American criticisms. So, but I have to warn you, I told you yesterday, on our panel today, besides 2 Hudson scholars, I wanted to invite a secret weapon to help the American side. This secret weapon was President Trump's campaign advisor on trade. He was in the New York Trump Tower working on trade in the transition team, maybe 2 seats down from me. And he's joining the re-election campaign for 2020 for President Trump to win again on the trade issue. And he writes many articles, including a recent one saying China ignored the WTO decision, saying China must let MasterCard, American Express, and the Visa be used in the whole Chinese market. China said, yes, fine, we will implement, and then didn't do it. In the meantime, Chinese interests developed the world's biggest credit card. It's now the world's biggest credit card everywhere. So this man is in the front row here, Curtis Ellis. I think he wants to become your friend, maybe not, maybe at least have lunch with us. But I hope he will get a chance to ask a question of our panel, if with your permission, so you have authentic Trump voice speaking. Okay, who goes first? Aparna? Henry, we have a new American strategy called Indo-Pacific Strategy. And we renamed India Pacific Command. You think we should all just sit down? What do you think? Okay, we follow Chinese guidance.
No. What I mean is that as a panel, you can probably
Okay, fine.
dialogue here.
We're all mic'd up. So the Indo-Pacific Strategy. President Trump mentioned this many times on his trip. China seems to be welcome to join, but China has attacked the Indo-Pacific Strategy as encirclement of China. What do you think?
Good morning. I'd like to first start by thanking Dr. Pillsbury for inviting me to speak here today. My remarks will, as Dr. Pillsbury mentioned, focus primarily on the geopolitical aspect of the discussion, the rise of China, U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, and how India plays into it. American grand strategy for the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific since the end of the Second World War centered on creating an Asian economic, diplomatic, and security architecture that ensured stability and security in the region. American preeminence was meant to ensure a rules-based liberal order which opposed ideological dominance or arbitrary assertions of territorial claims and instead promoted an economic growth and development for the region. The economic and military rise of China over the last 2 decades poses a challenge to American preeminence. China is gradually creating a new Asian order with Chinese primacy at its heart. U.S. strategy has therefore been one of renewed engagement with its partner and allies, from India, Japan to ASEAN and others, to construct a configuration that will be able to counter this. Among Asian countries, India has consistently viewed China's expanding influence with suspicion. Partly, this is a function of historical experience. India engaged China as an Asian brother from 49 to 62, only to become a victim of its aggression over a border dispute. Since 1962, India has noted China's efforts to build closer ties with its neighbors in an attempt to encircle India, as well as Chinese efforts to lay the groundwork for military and naval bases across the Indian Ocean region. With a population of more than 1 billion, India is also the only country with sufficient manpower to match that of China. Thus, India is central to the Indo-Pacific security architecture, as well as the economic and diplomatic architecture that the United States aims to set up for the region. Indian leaders have always seen their country as one that will play a role on the global stage, especially Asia, and the belief in India as an Asian leader is deeply ingrained. India's antagonistic relationship with its northern neighbor has multiple dimensions. There's a border dispute, there's a disagreement over Tibet, but there's also an economic dimension. For the last 2 decades, the two countries have strong economic ties. However, India perceives the growing Chinese economic and military might in South Asia and Indian Ocean as detrimental to Indian interests. India views it as a string of pearls strategy designed to primarily provide China an advantage in any potential conflict and leverage in negotiations over disputes. New Delhi is also extremely wary of Chinese bases and ports in the Indian Ocean, from Hambantota in Sri Lanka to Gwadar and Jiwani in Pakistan, as well as potential bases in Maldives and Djibouti. New Delhi views the Belt and Road Initiative as a continuation of Chinese strategic, more as a strategic policy and not an economic policy. In Pakistan, China has invested over $50 billion for development projects. Through a combination of readily available loans and gifts, China has created a strategic network across large parts of Asia and Africa and Latin America. And in many cases, this huge quantum of lending is designed to lure nations into a debt trap, leaving them forever beholden. China has also, over the last 2 decades, deepened its activities in the Indian Ocean. It has built military bases or potential military bases, secured access to ports and islands, and even sent in its submarines into a region that India sees as its sphere of influence. To counter these strategies, India has built deeper relations with countries like Japan, South Korea, the ASEAN, and the United States. India has in recent years promoted the idea of being a security provider in the Indian Ocean. India has deepened defense cooperation with countries in ASEAN, the Pacific, from Mauritius to Seychelles, from Duqm in Oman to Sabang in Indonesia. India also understands the need to build infrastructure, both within India but also in its immediate neighborhood. And therefore, Delhi prefers Tokyo as a partner. And so the India, Japan, Asia, Africa growth corridor is seen as a counter to providing nations with alternatives. In April of this year, Japan, United States, and India agreed to collaborate on infrastructure projects in South and Southeast Asia. And the recent announcement just 2 days ago about the United States revamping OPIC into U.S. International Development Finance Corporation with an investment of almost $60 billion towards infrastructure could also play a big role. India, Japan, the United States do agree on an open, inclusive Indo-Pacific, which upholds a rule-based liberal international order. And as the world's largest democracy, a multicultural society with a growing military heft, India does have the potential to be an American partner in the region. I will stop there now. Thank you.
Thank you. You didn't mention the South Asia initiative here at Hudson.
So we have a South Asia and India program almost for 4 years. Both of our experts are here today, me and then Ambassador Haqqani. You'll listen to him on the second panel. We focus on economic issues, on foreign and security policy, and we bring out a weekly newsletter. We have a separate blog which actually posts contributions from people around the region, and we have a number of books on India, Pakistan, and foreign policy.
So if Dr. Wang invites us from Hudson to go to his think tank in Beijing, are you willing to go on the delegation to Beijing?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, who you want to go next? You want to?
Sure.
Henry, you decide.
No,
Who's
no,
next?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity, Dr. Wang and Michael, as well as the Institute. I became aware of Hudson Institute a long time ago because I lived in Mid-Hudson area and I taught there for quite a few years. I thought, wow, are you guys located in New York or Mid-Hudson area? It turned out to be Washington, D.C. And later on, my daughter actually interned here for the Africa program. She was from Smith College as a student. And in looking also further, Hudson Institute has been really prominent in my, understanding of the ideology behind Hudson, that is libertarianism. I actually became aware of it because my past president at Chapman University is a libertarianist, and people say there's 1% in American population. 1% of American population believes in libertarianism. What is libertarianism? Well, based on some faculty members who I know, they actually treat Lao Tzu as the founding father of libertarianism. Americans, would you true, Michael? Is that true?
I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that,
Associated mainly with Cato Institute.
Oh, Cato.
You haven't confused Cato with Hudson, have you?
Okay, all right. But anyways, I think I might have made that mistake. But I think certainly this is related to free trade. Americans believe in free trade. Most presidents believe in free trade. Recently, I read an article in Chinese. It's called Global Personalities. They had a huge survey of presidents from Wilson to President Trump. All the presidents were surveyed about their beliefs about free trade or against free trade. Wilson, of course, was an architect of free trade, and Roosevelt was the one who made it happen. And of course, Bill Clinton was well known for accepting China into WTO. However, they highlighted two presidents who actually, one of them was Hoover, President Hoover, Herbert Hoover, who was doing exactly what President Trump is doing, and that led to the world economic crisis in 1929. And later on, of course, we're at this turning point of history. And I believe that the current administration of the United States is waging the largest trade war ever in the history of mankind. And with the threat of adding more to double it, almost double it, and put in tariffs on every dollar of the goods sold by China to the United States. And it's interesting that as an educator myself, studying intercultural communication, I received education in China, English education back in the 80s, and I became a professor, and currently I'm also have a joint appointment, both in the United States and China, and keep traveling back and forth just to make sure that I'm really well informed on both fronts. And it's indeed that the world is being reversed, and people have to make sense of it, in that somehow on this side of the world is the replication of some kind of a boxer movement taking place. And maybe the leaders of the boxer movement just come from this town, out of this town. I know boxer movement started in Shandong, but not in Beijing, but it kind of led to the DC area, Beijing area. That is to build walls against Mexico, and also the wall about regular cultural exchanges. And I've received education in the civil rights tradition. And I believe that communication is so vital, exchanges is so vital for the peaceful relationship between the United States and China during the past 4 decades. And now we were suddenly at this point, we had to think about, are we going back to the old days when there was that so-called MAD? MAD is mutually assured destruction. A doctoral student of UCI and by the way, he actually served as an intern, an assistant for Professor Peter Navarro. I'm from the same town. However, he was never invited to a UCI China talk by his own colleagues.
UCI is University of California at Irvine? Is that what UCI
I don't teach there, but
that's what you mean by
that's
UCI?
Right.
Okay.
Yes, correct, yes. But he interned for him. He and I, he was born and raised an American, from Ohio, and we wrote a op-ed, decided to say, hey, are we trying to repeat the MAD or MAG? Our concept of MAG is mutually assured gains. From MAD to MAG. Can we make it happen? Or are we trying to repeat the same kind of a MAD situation? I think we're intelligent enough. However, I have a point to make about China studies currently, that I believe that knowledge about China needs to be really updated. I'm fluent in both languages. I'm fluent with both cultures. I try to keep up every day. I try to read all kinds of news outlets, including tabloids in both countries. And I come to the conclusion that really the world is changing so much. The United States is producing so much information, and China is beginning to produce so much information. Much of them is really scholarly. And of course, including President Xi Jinping's think tank to produce so much thought, systematic thought. People like David Shambaugh cannot catch up with the knowledge, with the new knowledge generated. And I think, somehow our scholars are falling behind. Scholars like us, think tank people, are falling behind. Why? Because we have 8-hour work, 5 days a week, right? And then regular time, we play sports, we enjoy our free time, but the world doesn't work like that. The real world is day and night going on, and you have to keep up. Otherwise, you get lost. And this is what I conclude with think tank people and scholars and students of U.S. China relationship or globalization itself. That is, we have to figure out a way to share information on both fronts. But somehow, currently, we don't have that much communication taking place. And this is pretty sad. Not much. So therefore, I treasure this opportunity, hopefully to really, just like Dr. Wang suggested, that we really need to build a mechanism of communication besides government to government, negotiations, including India too. We just really need to build, a mechanism of exchange of information. Australia has created this term called new sinology. Germany has created this concept of new sinology. They find a way to study China on its own terms. I know there was a split in the traditional, there was sinology in European tradition, but later on, United States created this idea of China studies, primarily, politics, economy, but more of a liberalizing China on the ideological, liberal ideological order. But I think we need to, at this point, China is really beginning to charge its own waters, and also trying to make it more inclusive. What I would try to say is that China used to be well known for a trinity of 3 religions. Are you aware of this? I'm sure you're aware, right? Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. If you're in office, you're a Confucianist. If you're out of the office, you retire, you are actually a Taoist. If you're on the verge of death, you're Buddhist, right? So Chinese are very, very flexible. And I came to this conclusion. I said, look, one philosopher whose name is, he's originally from Nankai, he said something like, he actually has said this, 马魂中体西用. 马魂 means Marxism as the spirit or the soul of contemporary Chinese politics. That's his ideal, right? He actually articulated this concept in the early 1990s. Fang Keli is his name. He's a well-known retired professor of philosophy from Academy of Social Sciences. And the Zhongti means Chinese learning as the source of meaning and identity. 西用 means Western ideas, so we learn, we open up and absorb. And this is, I think, is the ideological sources of Xi Jinpingism, if you don't mind. He's actually trying to draw upon all of these 3. The reason there is this because I remember when I first came here was 92. When I went back to China, I heard people say mainstream economists. I said, who are the mainstream economists? He said, those people from Chicago, from, students from Freeman. I suddenly was, in other words, the party was losing grip on their own ideology. And that means would lead the chaos, political instability. And so, and just think about this, that there was overproduction, overcapacity. What happened? What caused the overcapacity? It was the free market. It was without any regulations at all. And you know what? In the socialist country, there was economic crisis. Right on the spot.
I have to ask you a question.
I'm going to conclude.
To conclude,
yeah,
maybe help you. In Chinese culture, if Dr. Henry Wang and the vice president of CCG, Mabel, have made a long presentation that they have a 9-person team produce this presentation. I praised the details they gave about the 14 proposals. In Chinese culture, you have just completely ignored their presentation.
Oh.
You didn't say anything about the 14 points. You didn't say anything about their diagnosis.
Okay.
In Chinese culture, that means you do not agree with their report.
No. That's actually
it's called the 礼貌上的拒绝.
礼貌上的拒绝.
Light refusal. So do I understand you correctly? You oppose this report.
No, I'm not opposing it. I'm
Or
actually.
you haven't read it. You haven't read it.
I did read them, of
Is
course.
anything you agree in this report?
I agreed.
This panel, Richard's next, we're discussing this
I agree
remarkable
with all
report.
of them. But I was
You
not
want
to say,
Do you completely agree with
not
everything?
completely 100%. And I listed all the recommendations. It turned out that all of those recommendations are actually the same recommendations as Dr. Wang. So I didn't want to repeat that. I wanted to provide this more of a theoretical, intellectual observation of what happens.
So you're not filibustering. You're here to support Dr. Wang's report. right? You agree with this?
I agree with this, and I agree. Remember, mutual gains is the idea behind these suggestions, these recommendations. So I'm providing more of an intellectual, I would say, a theory behind this. And this is what I really mean. And also, that also relates to the Chinese ideology.
You want to give 5 minutes to the last panel member? He's
just a
sitting
few
here
minutes.
waiting
It's on
to speak.
centrality.
You're kind of taking up his time.
I hope you don't feel criticized by my remarks.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Sure, and I will just make a short comment because I understand we're running out of time, and we do want to discuss the interesting report with.
Well, I want to know if humanitarianism, what is it?
So thank you.
Libertarianism, is that the motto of Hudson Institute? I thought we were for democracy.
I will pass. We have the president of Hudson here. I'll let him speak on that question. I'm going to just want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you for allowing me to participate. I have the program I run here at Hudson is focused on, it addresses trade somewhat. It's focused on keeping nuclear materials and weapons away from other countries and non-state actors. So I was just going to touch on 2 points that are very topical in the news, and the first one would be the recent sanctions on the Russian arms sales to China, which were announced last Friday and have received the Chinese response. And then very quickly, the events in the UN Security Council today, where President Trump is making a presentation on basically on this whole topic of limiting the spread of weapons of mass destruction. The first, and this is more a question to the experts here, I was a bit surprised by the sharpness of the Chinese reaction to the sanctions that were announced on the Russian arms sales. And these are related to legislation which President Trump didn't want, but has implemented as required by law to punish or counter America's adversaries through sanctions. And they were applied on Friday to China's Equipment Development Department, which is the main importer of foreign military technology. The law requires these sanctions for any significant transactions involving Russia's intelligence or arms sale. And I think that it was almost inevitable that China was going to be touched by these sanctions. It was the first country that purchased some very advanced Russian systems, the S-400. China doesn't buy weapons from the United States or other Western countries, so some of the struggles we're having, whether to apply these to India, Turkey, don't really apply. And the Russia-China defense relationship has been very destabilizing, becoming even more so to many of the American goals in India, with respect to South Asia, with respect to Japan, with respect to other allies. So I was kind of surprised by how sharply the Chinese reacted. They called the ambassador, which I might have expected, but they also they recalled their chief Navy person who was attending an international conference here and suspended military ties. And they didn't even do that for some of the Taiwanese arms sales. So I'm a bit puzzled on that, why and provoke such a strong reaction, and a bit concerned because one of the things I think we've seen in the trade area is that even as we've gotten into this struggle over tariffs and trade. And you mentioned mutual assured destruction, the idea that if countries wouldn't go to actual conflict with war and using major nuclear weapons because they would be knowing they would be destroyed in return because the other side could assuredly destroy them. So in the China-U.S. economic relationship, you might say it's mad again, but mutually assured depression. If we go too far down this line, we're both going to suffer. But so far, we've kept the security cooperation in the trade area pretty well protected. I mean, I think that both China and the U.S. in the past decade have made a lot of progress in preventing the diversion of WMD-related materials to non-state actors. I mean, there was problems with earlier Chinese behavior with respect to Pakistan and so on, but I think it's been improved. We've managed to develop a joint center where we're training Chinese and other international experts in South Asia on non-proliferation and nuclear security issues. We've worked together to monitor the exports that are going from China to the United States and other countries to make sure that they're not carrying anything dangerous in that regard. And there's a lot of joint declarations and cooperation in the IAEA and so on I don't want to get into. Now, there's still differences on Korea and Iran, even as we're cooperating in some dimensions with respect to that. And we want to work on that further. But I really think it's important to preserve this cooperation because given what looks to be an ongoing Russia-U.S. tensions, I think it's really important that China and the U.S. continue to work in to perhaps fill the gap that's going to be weakened by that stalemate. I mean, China, I think, can play even a more important role in leading some of the initiatives, such as the global initiative to counter nuclear terrorism and so on. I'm happy to go into this more detail, but I think we all really want to discuss this really interesting report.
Richard, thank you for bringing that up because it adds a little ammunition to the third scenario, which I called the new Cold War. That here is a channel that the U.S. and China are trying to establish between our joint staff and their joint staff. For this sanction, which, as you say correctly, is required by our law, the Chinese are stopping the channel from being created. It's supposed to start today. Then the other Chinese reaction, I agree with you completely, to pull back a delegation that's here talking about sensitive military matters, it's really quite shocking. And the message being sent feeds the narrative that the Chinese are the enemy. This is how they treat us. So I think our third scenario has a little more ammunition added to it by the events of the last couple of days. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, now I promise the magic weapon. You think he should come up to the podium or just
please, whatever.
stand up?
Yeah.
I prefer you come to the podium if the microphone's still working.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce President Trump's campaign advisor on trade, his transition team advisor on trade, and the member of the re-election of President Trump in 2020 advisor on trade, Curtis Ellis.
It's a pleasure.
You don't get much time, though. I'm going to have to be mean to you.
Okay, I did not prepare any remarks, so I will simply review what I've heard and just offer some my thoughts on this. I appreciate President Weinstein's promise to free us of illusions of the past, and I think that's the most important thing we can do, and probably the best way forward is to let's be free of the illusions of the past, one of which is that China is a market economy. I think China is no longer the weak sister. China is a accepted great power in the world. And the system they have is not a free market system. It's socialism with Chinese characteristics, which would mean, if we accept that we have every right to impose countervailing duties on subsidized goods. This is just the normal order of things. They don't need to be treated, especially as a developing country, according to the WTO or in any kind of Paris Climate Accord. They're a major power, a major economy. So maybe that's one of the illusions of the past that we need to dispense with. Recognize China's true place in the world, which is one of greatness. I wanted to note that your presentation, your excellent presentation, cited Moody's and other economic forecasts. Let's free ourselves of the illusion that these economic forecasts are in any way accurate. It was not that long ago when we were told we could never have more than 2% growth in America. That's been disproven. These economic forecasters never anticipated the crisis of the mortgage meltdown. No one saw that coming. Only a few people. So don't place too much stock in what Moody's or any of the other great economic forecasters tell us, because we are in uncharted waters. I found it interesting. Thank you. I don't want to just sit here and deliver one-liners, but I did find it amusing of seeking to, I appreciate the offer of Chinese investment in Midwestern states that have been in infrastructure that have been affected by deindustrialization, considering what the major cause of deindustrialization in those states was. And this is, again, in the 19th century, in America's period of industrialization, we were facing the model, the global model at that time was that Britain would be the workshop of the world, the factory of the world. Today, it seems that China is the factory of the world, and I would say we should look to parallels as to how the U.S. dealt with global economy at that time was the British Empire. China did not fare well in that setup. if now the global economy is going to be led by China, I don't know if the U.S. is going to fare well in such a setup. Let's dispense of another illusion that countries are not pursuing their national interest. Everybody is pursuing their national interest. They may talk about the global economy, but it is to the degree to which it helps their national interest. And I think if we recognize that, then we will find the path forward. And finally, let me just say this, and maybe a question I can put out there. The last speaker talked about the reaction to the sanctions. I find it interesting, the reaction, Chinese reaction to the tariffs that the administration put in effect. Those tariffs our tariffs came into effect after an investigation and were based on World Trade Organization criteria, subsidies, intellectual property violations, et cetera, et cetera. There seems to be a general acceptance within the US media that the tariffs that China put into effect were aimed at the Trump voter. And even one of your slides, you pointed to that. The base voter, the farmers. China Daily took out a huge ad insert in the Des Moines Register. There seems to be a blatant recognition that China is targeting its tariffs to interfere in our election. So I don't know if that's a WTO criteria for imposing tariffs to influence another country's election, but on that, I will just leave it there. And of course, as Dr. Pillsbury said, there is the question of the Chinese credit card and the American credit card situation. So as much as we talk about reform in China and agreements, China did agree in 2011 to open up its credit card market, but nothing has happened. So anyway, thank you very much.
And if Henry invites the Hudson delegation to come to Beijing, which we don't know yet, but if he does, would you be willing to come with us?
Oh, yes,
Oh, thank you.
certainly. I would love to. Thank you.
No guarantees. Okay, questions from the floor for a few minutes, Henry?
Sure.
And then we go to panel 2. We have to get up and change microphones. You want to call on who's going to ask a question? 有不少的中国记者来参加。哦，你呢？你决定吧。Anybody here from Xinhua? I think we take Xinhua first. Okay, you are. 你自己
Victor Lee, I'm a non-resident senior fellow at CCG and also president of China Society. I have a question regarding job. And President Trump really talking about the importance of get jobs back and the lost job to China like this. But right now the employment rate is so low. So why is still this is a relevant issue? Thank you.
Maybe have a few and then we'll
Okay. Jorgen.
I have a question for Dr. Pillsbury regarding the white paper that China just released over the past few days. I'm sure you've read it. Do you find the statistics and the arguments provided in the white paper are well-founded? Do you agree with the premises? And do you find it helpful in explaining the positions and policies of the Chinese
I
government?
give you the answer 3 no's. No, no, and no. It does not move toward a constructive resolution of the trade dispute. It has some factual misinformation, and it did not address the main items in the USTR report of March 21st this year, which has more than 1,000 footnotes, several hundred examples. It ignores it. It does not address Peter Navarro's report on economic aggression, which he presented right here at this podium. It simply ignores these legitimate criticisms issued by the White House, the executive office of the president. So in that sense, it's an insult to the White House to simply ignore all the work and testimony and research that's gone into these 2 presidential documents. You like my answer?
I'll take account in your answer.
3 no's.
Thank you.
OK， 第3呢？我们要一个老外。
Chris Scott from Asia Times, and unfortunately I had a question about the more pessimistic scenario of a new Cold War. The news website Axios reported this week that the Trump administration is preparing a administration-wide broadside against China, which would focus on calling them to account for cyber theft and election interference, which you mentioned. Also, I was wondering what that might entail, as it was a question for anyone, Dr. Pillsbury, or anyone in the poll, what you might think that could entail.
I read the Axios article. It said at the very end that Peter Navarro would be the main person to do this. I don't know if it's true or not. It's a leak, unauthorized leak from the White House. I think it's a good idea, though. It's learning a lesson from China's united front strategy to try to make your case to everybody and take some, answer disagreements and then pull over your allies. So it's like the White House believes in united front tactics. I think that's a good thing. But it's a leak, so I don't know if it's true. 要不要回答? Any more? 第4呢? 4th question.
Hey, I'm Bill Gauss with SE International, and I'm probably the only car maker in the room, I think. And I appreciate the emphasis on the automotive and truck industries in your report. I did have a question. Can you clarify the 121 million car import number that you quoted? Did I misinterpret that in the presentation? There's about 70 million vehicles of 4 tires or more built in the world each year total. So there's something amiss, and if you could explain.
That's right there. Chinese consumers bought 121 million cars imported from the U.S. So 他请问有没有根据说明这句话?
Well, we'll check on that, get back to you, sure. But I would like really...
more questions?
Yeah. The general questions and comment, I can maybe make some comment on that. And I think that because we see that, we are in the 21st century, and the world is no longer as in the before, 70 years ago. I mean, every country is self-sustained, that you produce your own stuff and then you just, get on with it. But really now it's so intertwined. So I think, how we can better, get rid of this traditional or old style thinking is really important, because I think that we have to really work on with each other and rely on each other, and not really having this very traditional, even old style, outdated thinking, even Cold War thinking on that. So because I think that it's so obvious that people exchange between China and the U.S. is so big now, and so U.S. companies making 500 billion revenues in China. That has been several calculations have proven that. So I think that now we got to be very careful not to really have some incident that we're going to deny everything that we already have achieved. I think you mentioned about a report 301, but as I just said in my report, one of the examples that report cited that on the intellectual force technology transfer, but according to the AmCham survey, it's only 19% a company said they have something like that. Majority, 81% didn't say they have any force technology transfer, and even out of this 19% said that, 2/3 of them said it's not related with the Chinese government. So even I think the White House report has to be accurate and punctual as well, so that we don't have.
I have good news for you, Henry.
Yeah.
I actually read all the footnotes, and a footnote like 990, it's something you wrote. Your name is in there, Wang Huiyao. Some kind like a book. So you are on the wrong side. You are on the White House side.
No.
No. Maybe it's a similar name. Maybe, but it says Wang Huiyao. cite you twice.
No, I think that we got to be really accurate on those statistics. So I think that
Could be a mistake.
yeah. So a dialogue likes to clarify, to
Yes.
really exchange is really important.
And that's,
so
why,
that we don't
that's
get-
why you think think tanks have a role to play,
That's right.
not official negotiations,
No. Negotiations is also important, but I think with the
in
track-
addition to official negotiations.
I think that get the
But right now, China will not come. They canceled the.
well. I think nobody wants to come if in this current situation, people wants to come, then you hit them with a big stick. I don't think anybody like that. So I think it's really we have to have a mutually respectful situation that I think we can come with a dialogue.
You and I both oppose a new Cold War, right? We don't want to see a
absolutely.
new
We
Cold
don't
War.
want to see a new Cold War. Yeah.
I think you have some more questions. You want to have more questions, or shall we go to panel 2? It's already 11.
We should go to panel 2 probably. Yeah.
11:20.
Yeah, we still have some time at this panel 2 probably. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We changed microphones.
Good.